Back in 2016, I lived in a small, tight-knit town surrounded by dense forests. There wasn't much to do besides hiking and camping, unless you wanted to drive an hour to the next larger town. My friend Matt and I often went camping, and this time, he suggested a spot recommended by another friend. It was only a short 15-minute drive from the town's outskirts, but there was no official parking, just a narrow trail leading into the woods. After walking for about an hour, we reached the supposed campsite. Matt's friend had mentioned a great lake view, but what we found was more of a murky swamp, overgrown and uninviting. Laughing it off, we noticed a lone tent on the opposite side of the water. As my eyes scanned further along the shoreline, I spotted a figure standing there, watching us. Trying to keep things from feeling awkward, I gave a small wave. The person didn't respond but remained eerily still. We assumed they were the owner of the tent, and went about setting up our own camp on a hill away from the water. Throughout the day, we occasionally glanced toward the tent, but the person was never near it. Either they were wandering deeper into the trees, or they had left entirely. As the sun set and we built our fire, we eventually stopped thinking about it, until something happened. Matt suddenly leaped up from his chair, his eyes locked on something behind me. I turned and saw the outline of a figure standing just 20 feet away. Their long, unkempt black hair blended with the darkness, and their clothes were equally shadowy, making it hard to tell if they were a man or a woman, or if they were holding anything. Matt called out, "Hey! Are you alright?" I followed up with a nervous, "Do you need something?" The person lingered for a moment, then abruptly turned and hurried off into the night. Matt and I exchanged an uneasy glance, trying to shake off the unsettling encounter. We reasoned that it must have been the same person from across the pond, but there was no real explanation for why they had been watching us from so close. Somehow, we managed to go to sleep. In the middle of the night, I woke to Matt urgently unzipping my tent and shaking me awake. His breathing was ragged, and his face was filled with fear. "Someone was standing right outside your tent," he whispered, his voice barely holding steady. "I saw them through my tent opening, and when they noticed me, they ran." A chill ran down my spine, but I tried to stay calm. Our options weren't great, either risk hiking the dark, narrow path back or stay put and hope nothing worse happened. We decided to rebuild our fire and stay up until sunrise, keeping our bags packed in case we had to make a run for it. At the first light of dawn, we wasted no time leaving. Later that day, we reported the incident to the police, thinking it might help warn other campers. To our surprise, they called us back for further questioning. It turned out the tent we had seen belonged to a person who had been missing for over a month. The authorities searched the area but found nothing else. When they showed us photos of the missing person, both Matt and I knew for certain it wasn't the same person we saw watching us. That realization sent a wave of dread through me. Whoever had been out there wasn't just another camper. They may have had something to do with the missing person's fate. And if Matt hadn't woken up that night, I might have disappeared too. I was camping out in the woods behind my property, something I did often since I had a decent stretch of forested land. I had a small clearing about a 10 to 15-minute walk from my house that I liked to use for these solo trips. It wasn't anything special, no breathtaking views or lakes, just a quiet place to unwind. On this particular evening, sometime in mid-fall, I headed down around 4 p.m. to set up camp. As I was unpacking, I happened to notice someone walking in the distance, maybe 100 yards away. Given that this was my land, seeing a stranger out there was unusual. It wasn't a public trail, and the only way to get there was by trespassing from a neighbor's property. The person was moving away from my house, heading toward the neighboring woods, so I decided not to think too much of it. The next few hours were peaceful. I sat back in my chair, enjoying the quiet sounds of the forest. As the sun dipped below the trees and darkness settled in, I built up my fire, stacking logs and sticks onto the flames. It was about an hour into the night when I suddenly heard something that made my skin crawl: footsteps. But not just any footsteps. Someone was running. A full-on sprint through the trees. I turned in the direction of the sound, my eyes scanning the pitch-black woods. The heavy footfalls rushed past my campsite, moving deeper into the forest before fading into the distance. Who the hell runs through the woods in the dead of night? The eerie thought gnawed at me, but after a few minutes of silence, I convinced myself that whoever it was had no interest in me. Maybe it was some reckless hiker or a lost hunter. Still, my instincts told me to stay on high alert. I kept my fire going for another 2 hours, determined to shake the unease. Nothing else happened, and eventually, I decided to turn in for the night. I let the fire die down, climbed into my tent, and drifted off to sleep. That didn't last long. I woke up to the unmistakable sound of rapid footsteps, this time, heading straight for my tent. My heart pounded as I sat up, frozen in place. The footsteps stopped abruptly, just outside the thin fabric walls. A shadow loomed on the other side, shifting slightly, as if whoever was out there was peering inside. Then, a sharp sound, a blade slicing through the fabric. My breath caught in my throat as I turned to see a knife slowly carving a slit into my tent. And through that opening, a pair of eyes locked onto mine. Panic surged through me. Without thinking, I lunged forward, bursting out of the tent and sprinting into the woods. I shouted as loudly as I could, hoping to startle them, to make them hesitate just long enough for me to escape. Adrenaline pushed me forward, and I didn't stop until I was back at my house. Gasping for breath, I turned toward the tree line and saw them. A figure stood just beyond the trees, watching me. I grabbed my phone and immediately called the police, keeping my eyes locked on the shadowy form in the woods. But by the time officers arrived, the person was gone. The next morning, authorities searched my campsite, but there were no leads. No footprints they could track, no abandoned gear, nothing. It was as if whoever had been out there simply vanished. The thought that terrified me the most wasn't just that they had a knife, or that they had been running around in the dark. It was the fact that they had followed me home. They knew where I lived. For the next month, I barely slept, jumping at every little noise outside my window. Nothing else has happened since, but I still live with the unease of not knowing who they were, or if they ever planned to come back. This happened 3 years ago, just as December was beginning. Where I live, winter doesn't fully set in until late December, and snow usually doesn't come until January. I loved camping and always tried to fit in as many trips as possible before the cold made it impossible. For my last trip of the season, I took a few days off work and drove about an hour north to a trail I had camped at before. I knew it would be a little colder up there, but I had the right gear to handle it. I arrived at the trailhead a little after sunrise. There were only 2 other cars parked there. One was a normal-looking minivan, and the other was a mud-covered truck that looked like it had been off-roading. I figured I might run into some other campers along the way. As I hiked in, I passed an older man and a kid heading back toward the lot. They looked like they had camped the night before, which likely explained the minivan. That meant, as far as I could tell, there should have been just one other person or group out there. But when I got to the campsite, it was completely empty. It was a quiet little clearing near a slow-moving pond, and I set my tent up near the trees. For a while, I sat and wrote in my journal, but as the day went on, the temperature dropped. I decided to get a fire going for warmth. Not long after I lit the fire, another person appeared on the trail. He was a man, maybe in his 40s, wearing a heavy coat with a cloth covering the lower half of his face. He had a small backpack slung over his shoulder. As he walked past me, I noticed something odd. His backpack looked completely empty. The fabric wasn't stretched or bulging in any way, like there was barely anything inside. He didn't speak, just kept walking until he reached the opposite side of the clearing. Then he sat down against a tree, facing the pond. At first, I thought he might be waiting for a friend, but as time passed, 45 minutes, maybe more, no one else showed up. Even stranger, the man didn't move. He just sat there, staring out at the water. A creeping unease settled in. There was something off about him. Then, without warning, he stood up and started walking toward me. He stopped at the edge of my fire and smiled. But his eyes didn't match the smile. They were heavy, tired, and empty, making his grin seem unnervingly forced. "Hope you don't mind if I share your fire," he said, his voice casual. "It's colder than I expected." I nodded, trying to keep my tone friendly. "Yeah, no problem." But my instincts were screaming at me. I glanced at his backpack again. No tent, no real supplies. Nothing about him suggested he had come prepared for a night in the woods. "Did you bring a tent?" I asked. "It's supposed to get even colder tonight." He shook his head. "Nope." He didn't elaborate. For the next 10 minutes, we sat in silence. I tried to focus on the fire, but I could feel his eyes on me. A decision formed in my mind. I wasn't staying here. I forced myself to act natural as I stood up and casually walked over to my tent, grabbing my sleeping bag to start rolling it up. I didn't want to make it obvious that I was leaving, but I could feel him watching my every move. Then, without a word, he got up. He turned and walked back toward the tree where he had been sitting earlier, but he didn't stop. He continued into the woods, disappearing from sight. I held my breath, listening. The forest was silent. I didn't waste any time. I packed up as quickly as I could, leaving the fire burning in case he was watching me from the darkness. If he thought I was still there, maybe he wouldn't follow. The next 2 hours of hiking back were some of the most unnerving of my life. Every crack of a branch, every gust of wind had me on edge. I kept expecting to hear footsteps rushing up behind me. But I made it back to my car. As I passed the trailhead, I noticed the muddy truck was gone. If that had been his, fine. But if not, then how did he get there? And worse, what had he been planning to do if I had stayed? I don't know what would have happened that night, but the thought of it still lingers in the back of my mind.